Have you ever felt like no matter how much you achieve, it's never enough? That you keep working harder, giving more, proving more, but the feeling of being enough never seems to arrive. If that resonates with you, this episode isn't really about ambition, it's about the deeper psychological need to prove your worth, where it comes from, and how you can begin to break free from it. I'm Jyoti, your host, and welcome to From the Therapy Room, where we explore the psychology of mind, body, relationship, patterns, feelings, and so many things. I'm really glad you're here. Over the years, I have come across many questions that have stayed with me long after the conversation was over. Questions that don't ask for a quick answer, questions that seem simple at first but somehow continue unfolding long after you have stopped thinking about them. And today's episode begins with one of those questions. Why are you still trying to prove yourself? It's a small question, just a few words, but I have often found that the simplest questions have a way of opening the deepest doors. Because if we stay with the question for a little while, not rushing to answer it, not trying to be clever about it, it begins to take different forms. Maybe you're trying to prove that you're successful enough, that you're intelligent enough, that you're a good parent, a good partner, a good professional. Maybe you're trying to prove that you're not weak, that you can handle everything on your own, that you will never make the mistakes your parents made. Or perhaps you're trying to prove something that you have never said out loud, not even to yourself. That's you are worthy of being loved, that you matter, that's you're enough. What's interesting is that very few of us wake up in the morning thinking, today I'm going to spend the day proving my worth. It doesn't usually work like that. Instead, it quietly weaves itself into ordinary life, into extra hour at work that you couldn't really afford to give, into saying yes when every part of you wanted to say no, into feeling guilty for resting, into checking your phone one more time to see if someone has replied, into replaying a conversation on your way home, wondering if you have if you have said the wrong things, into believing that maybe if you just get one more qualification, earn one more title, become a little better, then something inside you finally become quiet. And perhaps that's what fascinates me most. Because this isn't just about achievement, it's not about perfectionism, it's not just about confidence, it's about something much deeper than any of those things. It's about the stories we begin telling ourselves about who we need to become in order to feel safe, accepted, respected, or loved. I don't think anyone consciously decides to spend their life trying to prove themselves. I think somewhere along the way, many of us simply begin believing that our value has to be demonstrated rather than experienced, that love has to be earned, that belonging has to be deserved, that rest has to be justified. And once those beliefs quietly settle into the background of our lives, they stop feeling like beliefs. They begin to feel like facts. People, perhaps that's why two people can live completely different lives and still carry the very same question beneath the surface. One may be building business, another may be raising children, someone else may be caring for aging parents, someone may be chasing academic success, someone else may have achieved everything they, they once dreamed of. Their lives look different, their personalities are different, their circumstances are different, and yet underneath it all, they may still be asking the same silent question. Am I enough now? I have often wondered whether that's one of the quietest burden of being human. Not that we want to grow. Growth is beautiful. Not that we want to contribute. Meaning matters. Not even that we want to achieve something worthwhile. There is nothing wrong with ambitions. The question is different. What happens when our achievements stop being expression of who we are and slowly become evidence we are collecting for a case we are still trying to win? Evidence that we are worthy, evidence that we belong, evidence that we deserve to take up space. The strange thing is that even when the evidence keeps growing, the verdict often never changes. And that's what I would like to explore together today. Not just why we strive, but why for so many people striving never seems to feel like enough. Where does that feeling begin? Why does it stay with us for so long? How does it quietly shapes our relationship, our work, our identity, and even the way we speak to ourselves when nobody else is listening? Because sometimes the most exhausting race isn't the one the world asks us to run, it's the one we never realized had already begun inside us. So let's talk about that. I sometimes wonder whether one of the greatest illusions we live with is the belief that we all always know why we are doing what we are doing. We tell ourselves fairly straightforward stories. I work hard because I'm ambitious. I always help people because that's just who I am. I like being independent. I don't like asking for help. I just have high standards. And often those explanations are true. But I don't think they are always the whole story. Human beings are fascinating that way. We become very good at explaining our behavior, but we are not always aware of what is quietly driving it. Sometimes the reason we give ourselves is the one that makes the most sense. The deeper reason is often much quieter, much older, and much more difficult to see. Take ambition, for example. We usually admire ambitious people, society certainly does. We are encouraged to dream bigger, work harder, push further, becomes the best version of ourselves. There's nothing inherently wrong with that. In fact, growth is one of the things that gives life meaning. It's deeply human to want to learn, to create, to contribute, to leave something valuable behind. The question isn't whether ambition is good or bad. The more interesting question is, what is your ambition asking from you? Is it inviting you into a fuller expression of yourself? Or is it quietly asking you to earn your place in the world? Because those are two very different journeys, even if they look exactly the same from the outside. Think about the moments we rarely talk about, the promotion that brought relief more than joy, the compliment that felt reassuring but only for a few hours, the achievement that immediately gave me to another goal, the holiday where you couldn't relax because you felt you should be doing something productive, the evening when you finally sat down only to feel strangely guilty for resting. Many people know these moments. They have become so ordinary that we hardly question them anymore. We simply assume this is what adulthood feels like, always moving, always improving, always preparing for what next, almost as if life is something we are constantly rehearsing for rather than actually living. One of the paradoxes I have noticed is that the people who appear the most capable are often carrying invisible pressure that nobody else sees. They are dependable, organized, responsible, the person everyone turn to, the one who rarely lets anyone down. And because they carry it so well, people often assume it doesn't feel heavy. But carrying something gracefully doesn't mean it weighed nothing. Sometimes it simply means you have been carrying it for so long that nobody notices anymore, not even you. I think every generation inherit certain ideas about what make a person valuable. Sometimes it's success, sometimes it's sacrifice, sometimes reputation, sometimes resilience, sometimes being selfless, sometimes never showing emotion, sometimes always having the answers. Without realizing it, we absorb these messages. Not because someone sat us down and taught us, but because we watched, we listened, we noticed what was praised, we noticed what was criticized, we noticed who received attention, who was celebrated, who was overlooked, who was expected to simply cope. Long before we had the language to understand ourselves, we were already learning something about what it is meant to be good enough. The famous philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once wrote that the greatest danger is losing yourself so quietly that you don't even notice it's happening. I have always found that idea incredibly moving because losing yourself isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it happens politely, one compromise at a time, one expectation at a time, one role at a time, until one day you realize you have become extraordinarily good at being who everyone needed you to be. And you're no longer entirely sure who you are when nobody needs anything from you. Perhaps that's why this question, why are you still trying to prove yourself, can feel surprisingly emotional. Not because it's accusing us of anything, but because it's gently interrupt the momentum we have been living with. It asks us to pause long enough to notice something we may never have questioned before. Whose voice is setting the standard I'm trying to reach? When did I decide that this version of me wasn't quite enough? And perhaps the most important question of all, that if I have reached everything I'm striving for, would I finally feel at peace? Or would the finish line quietly move again? I don't think most people are exhausted simply because they are doing too much. I think many are exhausted because they are carrying an invisible expectation that has no natural ending. You can't find, you can't finish proving your worth. You can't complete being enough because those aren't tasks, they are beliefs. And beliefs don't disappear simply because life goes well. They tend to follow us until we become curious enough to ask where their meat first come from. And perhaps that's where our story begins. Not in adulthood, not in our career, not in a relationship, but much earlier, in the places where we first began learning who we thought we needed to become. I'm just thinking while I'm talking, where does the need to prove begin? If proving ourselves doesn't begin in adulthood, where does it begin? It's a question psychologists, philosophers, and storytellers have been exploring for generations. And while there isn't one single answer, there is something that seems to appear again and again. None of us enter the world wondering whether we are enough. A newborn doesn't compare. A toddler doesn't question whether they are worthy of love because they haven't accomplished anything. They simply exist. They cry when they need comfort. They laugh without worrying whether they will look silly. They reach for connection without apologizing for needing it. In many ways, our earliest years remind us of something we often spend adult, adulthood trying to rediscover, that our worth existed before our performance ever did. But gradually life become more complicated. We begin noticing patterns. We notice that what receives a smile, what receives silence, what receives disappointment, what receives praise. Sometimes these moments are obvious. A child is repeatedly told they should do better. Sometimes they are subtle. A parent is exhausted and emotionally unavailable, not because they don't love their child, but because life has asked more of them than they have to give. Sometimes a teacher praises one a sibling more than another. Sometimes a child learns that being easy keeps the family calm. Sometimes they discover that being successful brings attention. Sometimes humor becomes the safest way to belong. Sometimes perfection becomes the safest way to avoid criticism. No one necessarily sits a child down and says you must earn your worth. Life rarely teaches us so directly, instead, it whispers. And children are remarkably good at listening to whispers. One of the extraordinary thing about children is that they don't just learn information, they learn meaning too. If a parent is constantly overwhelmed, a child may quietly conclude, I shouldn't be a burden. If conflict fills the home, they may decide it, or they may decide keeping everyone happy is my job. If affection appears mostly after achievement, they begin they may begin believing success is how I stay connected. And these areas, these aren't conscious decisions, they are adaptive, they are creative. In many ways, they are acts of survival. The child isn't manipulating the environment, they're learning how to exist within it. The, the British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott spoke about something he called the true self and the false self. He wasn't suggesting that people become fake, he was describing something much more compassionate. Sometimes, in order to preserve important relationship, a child begins shaping themselves around what feel emotionally safe. They become the child who never complains, the child who never, who achieves, the child who take care of everyone else, the child who cause no trouble. And those adaptations are only deeply intelligent. They help the child remain connected to the people they depend on. The difficulty isn't that these adaptations exist. The difficulty is that many of us continue living inside them long after the danger has passed. And what's particularly fascinating is that two children can grow up in the same family and come away with completely different stories. One become fiercely independent, another become deeply anxious about being left. One strive for perfection, another gives up before trying. One learns to become invisible, another learns to become exceptional. The same family, different meaning. Because we don't respond only to events, we respond to what those events come to mean inside us. And meaning is profoundly personal. Carl Jung believed that much of what shapes us lives outside our conscious awareness, not hidden because we are trying to deceive ourselves, but because these patterns become so familiar that they simply feel like me. I have always been like this. I have always worried. I have always taken care of everyone. I have always pushed myself. Perhaps, or perhaps you have been practicing those ways of being for so long that they have become indistinguishable from your identity. I mean, there's an important difference. One says, this is who I am. The other asks, who did I need to become? The second question changes everything. And as therapists, we sometimes see this in surprising way. Someone says, I don't know how to relax, or I feel guilty when I do nothing, or I don't know why compliments make me uncomfortable. Or even when people appreciate me, I still feel like I'm falling short. On the surface, this seems like separate struggles, but underneath them, they often share something in common: a nervous system, a mind, an identity that learned very early on that safety and worth somehow become linked with doing more, being more, giving more, achieving more, holding everything together. And if that's the lesson you absorb, then slowing down can feel strangely unsettling. Not because rest is dangerous, but because it can feel unfamiliar. And the beautiful thing about becoming aware of these patterns isn't that we suddenly erase them. Human beings don't work that way. Awareness doesn't instantly rewrite a lifetime of learning, but awareness does something incredibly important. It gives us choice. Because patterns that remain unconscious tend to feel like fate. Patterns we begin to understand become something else. They become history. And history, while it shapes us, doesn't have to imprison us. So perhaps the question isn't simply what am I trying to prove? Perhaps there is another question quietly waiting beneath it. Who first taught me that I had something to prove at all? Not so we can point finger, not so we can blame, but so we can begin understanding the story we have been living. Often, without realizing, we were following a script that was written long before we had the chance to written our own. The next question is somehow is coming that who did you have to become? And one of the questions that has stayed with me over years is this: who did you have to become in order to feel safe? Not who you wanted to become, not who you dreamt of becoming, but who life quietly invited or perhaps required you to become. Because I don't think we simply discover our personalities. I think in many ways we also build them piece by piece, experience by experience, relationship by relationship, sometimes consciously, very often unconsciously. Imagine two children walking into the same room. One notices tension and immediately become quieter. The other notices the same tension and starts making joke. Neither responses is right, neither responses is wrong. Both are intelligent. Both are trying to answer the same question: how do I stay connected? That's something I find deeply moving about being human. Even our coping strategies often begin as expression of love. Not love in the romantic sense, but the deep human need to belong, to remain connected, to feel emotionally safe. Over time, those way of adapting being to harden into identities. Someone becomes the responsible one. They are the one who remembers everything, the one everyone depend on, the one who rarely asks for anything. People admire them. They seem capable, reliable, strong. But what people often don't see is how lonely it can feel to always be the person holding everyone else together. Because when you have spent years being the strong one, it can become difficult to admit that you are tired, or frightened, or simply in need of someone else. Someone else becomes the achiever. From the outside, they appear, incredibly driven, disciplined, focused. They collect degrees, build businesses, set goals, reach them, then quietly move on to the next one. People all often assume they are chasing success. Perhaps sometimes they are, but sometimes they are chasing something much less visible. The feeling that if they stop achieving, they might stop mattering. Others because becomes the caretaker. They know exactly what everyone else needs. They remember birthdays, notices changes in the mood, step in before everyone even asks. They're generous, thoughtful, deeply compassionate, but somewhere along the way they may have become so fluent in reading other people's emotion that they gradually lost touch with their own. They know how everyone else is feeling. They aren't always sure how they themselves are feeling. Some become fiercely independent. They rarely ask for help. They insist they'll manage, even when life becomes overwhelming. We often admire independence. And there is certainly beauty in being self reliant. But sometimes independence isn't simply freedom, sometimes it's a promise someone made to themselves a long time ago. If I don't need anyone, I can't be disappointed. Then there are those who spend years trying to disappoint, not to disappoint anyone. They avoid conflict, they apologize quickly, they keep the peace, even when it costs them their own. People describe them as kind, easygoing, flexible, and often they genuinely are. But beneath that kindness can sometimes live a quiet fear. What if saying what I really feel cost me this relationship? So they choose harmony, even if it means becoming strangers to themselves. What fascinates me really is that these identities often become so successful that the world rewards them. The achievers get promoted, the caretaker is appreciated, the strong one is respected, the pacemaker keeps everyone together, the independent person is admired, which means the pattern become even more deeply rooted, not because it's unhealthy in itself, but because nobody notices the cost, including the person living it. Carl Jung wrote about the persona, the face we present to the world. The word itself originally referred to the mask worn in ancient theater. That what's interesting is that the Jung didn't believe the persona was a problem. We all need one. We all occupy roles, friends, partner, professional, teacher, therapist, so many. These roles help society function. The difficulty began when we forgot the mask is a mask. And when we become so identified with the role that we lost contact with the person wearing it. And perhaps that's one of the quiet tragedies of adulthood. Not that we never we I mean not that we wear masks, but that we sometimes forget we ever had the freedom to take them off. The philosopher Martin Buber once wrote that real human life begins in genuine encounter. I have always loved that idea because genuine encounter isn't just about meeting another person, it's about meeting ourselves. Not the version that performing, not the version that proving, not the version that's endlessly adapting, but the quieter self underneath all of that. The self that existed before it learned what it had to become. And perhaps that's why this conversation matters because if our identity has been built even partially around proving something, then the question isn't whether we have been living falsely. The question is whether we have mistaken adaptation for identity, whether we have confused survival with selfhood, whether we have spent so long asking, who do I need to be, that we have forgotten to ask, who am I when I no longer have to earn my place? I don't know if there is any single answer to that question. In fact, I hope there isn't because perhaps becoming ourselves isn't a destination we arrive at once. Perhaps, perhaps it's a lifelong process of gently laying down the roles we no longer need until little by little. A life begin to feel less like a performance and more like a home. Let's just talk about why proving never feels like enough. Have you ever noticed how quickly the mind moves the finish line? You work towards something for months, perhaps even years. You imagine the day it finally happens. You tell yourself, once I'll get there, things will feel different. Maybe it's a promotion, a degree, a relationship, financial security, building a successful business, losing weight, publishing a book, buying a horse, or simply hearing someone important says, I'm proud of you. For a little while, it does feel different. There's excitement, relief, perhaps even gratitude. And then almost quietly, another thought appears. What's next? Don't lose it. Now you have to prove you deserve it. It remarkably how quickly yesterday's dream becomes today's expectation. I've often thought that many of us are not actually chasing success. We're chasing a feeling, the feeling that success promises peace, security, acceptance, freedom, enoughness. The problem is that those are emotional experiences, and emotional experiences don't automatically arrive because external circumstances changes. Someone can have extraordinary success and still feel profoundly insecure. Someone else can live a very ordinary life and experience a deep sense of contentment. So perhaps the question isn't what have I achieved? Perhaps it's what am I hoping this achievement will finally allow me to feel. That's a very different conversation. The psychologist Alfred Adler believed that much of human behavior is an attempt to move away from feeling of inadequacy and towards significance. I think there is something deeply human in that idea. We all want our lives to matter. We all want to contribute. We all want to feel that our existence has meaning. There is nothing unhealthy about that. The difficulty begins when significance becomes conditional, when we begin believing I matter only if I'm successful, only if I'm useful, only if people admire me, only if I never fail, only if I'm always needed. Notice how exhausting that sentence becomes because there is always another condition waiting to be fulfilled. One of the things I have observed is that the inner critique is rarely interested in celebrating. Its job is to keep moving. If you accomplish one thing, it is immediately points toward the next. If someone compliments you, it reminds you of your own flaws. If you read it rest, it questions whether you have earned it. It almost as though it's trying to protect you. And perhaps in its own ways, in its own strong ways, it is. Because somewhere in your story, slowing down may once have felt risky. Making mistakes may once have carried consequences. Being overlooked may once have hurt deeply. So the mind develops a strategy. Keep improving, keep anticipating, keep proving. Not because it enjoys exhausting you, but because it believes that staying one step ahead will keep you safe. Sometimes the very voice that feels the most critical is also the voice that once tried to protect you. It simply hasn't realized that your life has changed. There's a phrase in psychoanalysis that has always stayed with me. We don't simply remember our past, we repeat it. Not because we choose it, but because what remains unresolved often seeks expression. Sometimes that repetition appears in our relationship, sometimes in our work, sometimes in the impossible standards we keep setting for ourselves. We think we are chasing a new goal, yet emotionally we may still be having the same old conversation, just with different people, different places, different achievements. Viktor Frankl wrote that between stimulus and response there is a space, a, a space in which our freedom lives. I have always loved that idea, but I also think something else is true. Before we can choose differently, we often have to recognize that what has been choosing us, the old beliefs, the old fears, the old assumptions. Otherwise, we mistake habit of for identity and repetition for destiny. Perhaps this is why some people spend decades becoming more successful while never becoming any kinder to themselves. Their resume grows, their responsibility grows, their reputation grows, but inside the standard never changes. The conversation remains the same. Not enough. Try harder. Don't disappoint anyone. Don't let them see your weaknesses. And that's one of the quiet tragedies of proving no amount of external evidence can prematurely satisfy an internal belief that keep changing the rules. It's little like trying to fill a bucket that has a hole in the bottom. The answer isn't always pouring in more. Sometimes it's noticing where the hole come from. And perhaps that's why proving can become so addictive, not because we enjoy the pressure, but because every now and then it works. Someone praises us, we feel seen. Someone appreciates our effort, we feel valued. We accomplish something difficult, we feel worthy. For a moment, then the feeling fades, not because we failed, but because proving was never designed to create lasting peace. It creates temporary relief, and temporary relief is very different from deep security. Maybe that's the invitation hidden inside today's conversation. Not to stop growing, not to stop dreaming, not to stop creating, but to become curious about the place from which those dreams are growing. Because the same achievement can be an expression of joy or an attempt to silence shame. The outside may look identical, the inner experience is completely different. And perhaps that's the deeper work, not changing what we do, but understanding what quietly lives beneath why we do it. There's something coming in my mind that when really lives stop being a performance. Let, let's see, there comes a moment in some people's life, not always because they planned it, but because life somehow bring them to it. And when they begin asking a different question, not how can I become more, but who am I becoming? At first those questions sounds almost identical, but they are not. One is about accumulation, the other is about identity. One asks for more, the other asks for truth. Sometimes that shift arrives after a major loss, sometimes after burnout, sometimes after becoming a parent, sometimes after illness, sometimes after achieving everything you thought would finally make you happy, and discovering that something is still feels unfinished. Life has an interesting way of interrupting us. It doesn't always do it gently. Occasionally, the things we spend years building stop working in the way they once did. The endless busyness no longer distract us. The achievements don't satisfy us for so long. The applause feels quieter. And for the first time, we begin hearing another voice. Not the voice asking us to do more, but the quieter voice asking, is this really the life I want to keep living? Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. I've always found that idea, this incredibly powerful and moving because what feels inevitable isn't always inevitable. Sometimes it's simply familiar. We mistake repetition for personality. We mistake adaptation for character. We mistake old emotional loyalties for choice. And then one day we begin noticing something. Perhaps I don't always have to respond this way. Perhaps I don't always have to earn my place. Perhaps I don't have to keep negotiating for a worth that was never meant to be negotiated in the first place. One of the beautiful ideas in humanistic psychology is that every person has an innate movement toward growth, not toward perfection, toward wholeness. Those are very different things. Perfection asks, how can I eliminate every flaw? Wholeness asks, can I make room for every part of myself, including the confident parts, the uncertain parts, the generous parts, the frightened parts, the ambitious parts, the tired parts. Perhaps maturity isn't becoming fearless. Perhaps it is becoming less divided into ourselves. I have noticed that people who seem most at peace aren't necessarily the one with the easiest lives. They are often the ones who no longer spend every day arguing with themselves. They still work hard, they still care deeply, they still have goals, but there is less of courtroom inside their mind, less constant evidence gathering, less trying to convince themselves that they are worthy. Their achievements become expression of their values, not argument for their values. And I think that's a profound difference. There is also something deeply liberating about recognizing that we are allowed to change. Many of us remain loyal to identities that once protected us, the strong one, the responsible one, the one who never asks for help, the one who keeps everyone happy, the one who always succeed. But perhaps growing older also means asking, do I still need this identity? Because not every strength need to become a prison. Sometimes what once protected us eventually begin to limit us. And wisdom is knowing the difference. The philosopher Martin Heidegger spoke about living authentically, not in the sense of being perfect or completely self aware, but in the sense of living a life that genuinely belongs to you. I really love that because it's possible to be successful and still feel as though you're living someone else's definition of a meaningful life. It's possible to receive admiration while feeling strangely disconnected from yourself. It's possible to spend years becoming impressive without ever feeling deeply known. Perhaps because those are different human needs to be admired in one experience, to be known in is another. And many of us spend years chasing the first while quietly longing for the second. Maybe that's why this conversation matters so much, because eventually every one of us has to decide something. Am I building a life or am I building a resume for my self worth? Am I making choices because they reflect who I am or because I'm still hoping they will finally answer a question that no achievement has ever been able to answer? These aren't easy questions. In fact, they may stay with us for years, but perhaps that's their purpose, not to be answered once, but to become companion as we move through life. I don't think freedom comes from proving that we have become enough. I think freedom begins quietly, almost unexpectedly, when we become a little less interested in proving and a little more interested in living. When our relationships become places where we can be real, not just impressive. When our work become an expression of our values, not just our fears. When success becomes something we enjoy rather than something we depend on to tell us who we are. Perhaps that is what is means to grow, not becoming someone entirely new, but slowly returning to the person who was there before life convinced us that love, belonging, and worth always has to be earned. And perhaps you never had anything to prove. As I mean, I would really like to return to the question we begin with: why are you still trying to prove yourself? Perhaps by now your answer has changed, or perhaps it has become less clear. Sometimes that that's what happens when we slow down long enough to really think. The first answer is often the obvious one. The deeper answer usually takes a little longer to arrive. I have often wondered whether some of the most important changes in lives don't begin when we find new answers. They begin when we ask better questions. Not how do I become enough, but when did I begin believing that I wasn't? Not how do I make everyone approve of me, but what would happen if they didn't? Not how do I prove that I deserve love, but who taught me that love had to be deserved? And sometimes one honest question can change the direction of an entire life. Not overnight, but quietly, patiently, almost unnoticed. There is a Japanese art form called kintsugi, where when a bowl breaks, it hasn't hidden or thrown away. The cracks are repaired with gold. Not to pretend they never happened, but to honor the fact that they did. I have always loved that image, not because our lives needs to become beautiful through suffering, but because it reminds us that being shaped by life isn't the same as being diminished by it. Every one of us carries visible and invisible marks, disappointment, losses, moments of rejection, moments when we misunderstood ourselves, moments when other people misunderstood us. The goal isn't to erase those experiences. Perhaps the invitation is to stop allowing them to become the only evidence we use them when deciding who we are. The philosopher Soren Kierkegaard once said that life can only be understood backward, but it must be lived forward. I think that is one of the reason reflection matters. Not because we are trying to stay in the past, but because understanding where our story came from often gave us more freedom in deciding where it goes next. Without reflection, we tend to repeat. With reflection, we begin to choose, not perfectly, not all at once, but gradually. Maybe that's what growing older is really about, not becoming someone entirely different, but becoming less afraid of being fully ourselves, allowing ourselves to succeed without worshipping success, to love without losing ourselves, to care without carrying everyone, to rest without feeling that rest has to be earned, to make mistake without believing they define us, to change our mind without believing we have failed. Those are quite freedoms, but perhaps they are some of the deepest freedoms a human being can experience. I also wonder whether many of us spend years trying to become someone our younger self would finally be proud of. There is something tender about that because beneath all the striving, there is often a child who simply wanted to feel seen, wanted to feel chosen, wanted to know, I am okay just as I am. Perhaps the tragedy isn't that child. Perhaps the tragedy is that we keep asking the adult to solve a question that was never meant to be answered through achievements. Not through perfection, not through applause, not through becoming extraordinary, but through something much quieter. Recognizing that our value have never depended entirely on what we produce, or how much we sacrifice, or how perfectly we perform. I don't know what you are still trying to prove, and the answer may be different for every person listening today. For someone, it may be I'm worthy. For someone else, I'm not a failure, or I'm different from my parent, or I'm finally successful, or I deserve to take up a space. Whatever your answer is, I hope today's conversation hasn't encouraged you to stop dreaming. I hope it hasn't encouraged you to become less ambitious. I hope it hasn't suggested that achievement doesn't matter because it does. Creating, contributing, growing, building something meaningful. These are the beautiful parts of human being. Perhaps the invitation is simply this: let your achievement become expression of your life rather than the arguments for your worth. I mean, there is a profound difference between the two. And maybe, just maybe, one day you'll wake up and notice something has changed. Not because you have achieved everything, not because life has suddenly become easy, but because the quiet voice inside you no longer asks, what do I have to do to be enough? Instead it asks, given that I'm here, given this one precious life, how do I want to live it? I think that's a very different way of walking through the world. And perhaps that's where proving gently gives way to living. Thank you for spending this time with me. This was from the therapy room, Psychology of Mind and Body. If today's conversation has stayed with you, don't rush to answer it. Carry it with you. Notice where it appears in your life, in your work, your relationship, the way you speak to yourself. Sometimes the question we continue living will become more important than the answer we find. And if resonates, you can share it with your loved ones. If you want to listen to more of these kind of conversations related with psychology, relationship, trauma, and grief, please follow me on YouTube or Spotify or Apple Podcast. So until next time, take care of yourself. Thank you once again. See you next time. I'll be sitting next besides to you. Take care.